My daughter looked me in the eyes across the longest table I had ever sat at in my life, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Mum, you really didn't have to come all this way. This isn't exactly your kind of room." She laughed after she said it. A little polished laugh that matched her polished earrings and her polished husband and everything else in that Toronto hotel banquet hall that had been carefully selected to signal success. Her business partners laughed politely. The way people do when they're not sure if something is a joke or not. I was wearing my good blouse, the one I keep for occasions. I stood there holding my overnight bag because I hadn't been told where to put it, and I thought, I have been in worse rooms than this. I raised you in smaller ones. I didn't say that out loud. I reached into my bag, found my phone, and sent a single text message to a man named Stuart Holt. It said only, "I think it's time, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I ended up in that room at all. I live in a small house in Timmins, Ontario. The kind of house where the pipes complain every January and the kitchen window sticks in the summer. Because the frame has warped over decades of Canadian seasons, doing what Canadian seasons do. I've lived there for 31 years. My late husband, Warren, chose it because it was 2 blocks from the school where he taught geography, and because the backyard was big enough for a proper garden. He said a garden kept a person honest. Warren died 6 years ago. Heart attack on a Wednesday morning, which still strikes me as unfair somehow, like the week should have warned me. We had been married for 34 years. After he was gone, the house became very quiet in the particular way that houses do when they've been built around 2 people and suddenly there is only one. I kept his mug on the shelf. I still use it on Sundays. The handle has a small chip near the base where our daughter Simone dropped it when she was 9 years old and trying to be helpful. I never replaced it, Simone. My daughter. The one who laughed in the banquet hall. She was not always that person. I want to be clear about that because if I only describe what she became, you would never understand what we lost. When Simone was small, she used to bring me drawings she made at school. Not just the ones that came home in her backpack. She would make extras, special ones, just for me. She said, the ones at school were for the teacher, but the ones at home were the true ones. I kept a folder of them in the hall closet until the folder fell apart, and then I kept them in a shoebox. And then somewhere in the shuffle of years, I am no longer sure exactly where they went. But I remember the feeling of receiving them. She was a serious child who became a serious adult, which is not a flaw on its own. Serious people move the world forward. The problem isn't seriousness. The problem is when seriousness curdles into something hard, something that starts to look at softness as weakness and at age as inconvenience. Simone moved to Toronto at 24. To work in commercial real estate. She was good at it immediately. There is a specific kind of intelligence that knows how to read a room. Not the emotional temperature of it, but the financial potential. And Simone had that from the beginning. Within 3 years, she was managing accounts that made my yearly salary look like a rounding error. Within 5, she had started her own firm with her husband, a man named Graham Aldercott, whom she met at a networking event, and married 18 months later in a ceremony that cost more than Warren and I spent on our first home. Graham Aldercott. I should tell you about Graham. He was not an unkind man, exactly. Unkind implies deliberate effort. Graham was something more passive than that. He was the kind of person who looked through you if you weren't useful to him. Not with cruelty, but with a bored vacancy. The way you look past a piece of furniture that has always been in a room. He called me Simone's mum. For the first 3 years we knew each other, not as a warm nickname, because he had not retained my actual name. My name is Agnes. Agnes Norwood. I am 63 years old. I taught elementary school for 27 years. I have 2 sisters and a vegetable garden, and a cat named Pemberton, who is very fat and entirely unrepentant about it. I know how to change a tire. I once drove 14 hours straight through a snowstorm to get back to Simone when she was sick with pneumonia in her 2nd year of university. I did not tell her that part until years later because I didn't want her to feel guilty. I just wanted her to get better. That is the person Graham Aldercott had not retained the name of. For a while, I told myself it was just how certain people were. I told myself Simone was busy, building something, that the distance between us was temporary and logistical, not emotional. And there were visits, holidays, phone calls that lasted long enough to feel real, so I kept watering what I hoped was still there between us. Then came the November dinner. Simone called me in October. I was deadheading the last of the dahlias in the back garden when my phone rang, and I nearly didn't answer because I had dirt on my hands and my reading glasses inside. But I saw her name and I picked up. "Mum," she said. She sounded pleased, which caught my attention because Simone at her most polished tends toward neutral. "We're hosting a client dinner in Toronto. 3rd of November. Some of our biggest investors are coming, and I thought," a small pause, "it might be nice to have you there." I stood in the garden with dirt on my hands, and I felt something open in my chest that had been quietly closed for a while. "I'd love that," I said. "Good. It's at the Fairmont." Very formal, so. Another pause, this one slightly longer. "Dress accordingly." I said I would. She said wonderful. We hung up. I stood outside for another few minutes just looking at the garden. Warren used to say I could read weather by watching how the garden held itself. What I felt that afternoon was something like hope, which is a specific kind of weather. Warm front, the promise of something clearing. I should have looked closer at those clouds. I drove to Toronto. I know Simone's assumed I would fly, but the drive gives me time to think, and I had been looking forward to the thinking. 7 hours from Timmins with a coffee stop in Sudbury, and the radio for company. I got there the afternoon before the dinner, stayed at a modest place near Bloor, and spent the evening pressing my good blouse and trying to decide between the silver earrings Warren gave me for our 25th anniversary, and a newer pair I'd bought last spring that Simone had once briefly said were nice. I chose Warren's. I always do eventually. The Fairmont Ballroom on a November evening looks the way money sounds when it talks about itself. Confident, golden, slightly exhausting. I arrived exactly on time, which I know now was already a mistake. When you come from a world where punctuality is respect, you don't immediately understand that in other worlds it means you've arrived before the room has decided what it thinks of you. Simone saw me across the lobby. For just a moment. 1 second, maybe 2. I saw her face the way it used to be. Open. And then she recalibrated. "Mum," she kissed my cheek. "You drove? It's a nice drive." She glanced very briefly at my blouse. Then she smiled. "Let me introduce you." The partners and investors were already arranged around the long table in a private dining room. Crystal glasses, linen napkins folded into elaborate shapes, a centerpiece of white flowers so perfect they looked artificial. Graham stood near the far end, holding a glass of something amber, and when he saw me, he gave a small nod the way you nod at someone you recognize but cannot immediately place. I set my bag down near the door, because there was nowhere obvious to put it, and nobody offered. Simone introduced me efficiently, in the way that people introduce background details. "This is my mother. She's up from Timmins," and then the conversation moved on, because conversations like that are rivers. And I was a stone someone had pointed to briefly before continuing downstream. I found my seat. It was at the table, but slightly removed from the main cluster of conversation, the way a chair that was added at the last moment sits slightly away from the table's natural shape. I noticed this, but told myself I was imagining it. The first hour was fine. I listened. I can be a very good listener. I asked a few questions that were answered politely and briefly. A woman named Rosalind across from me talked about a development project in Etobicoke with the enthusiasm people usually reserve for describing a child they love. I told her it sounded ambitious. She looked surprised that I had been following the conversation at all. Then came the moment everything changed. One of the senior investors, a man named Derek Faulkner, who wore his confidence like a well-tailored coat, leaned towards Simone and said something about legacy, about how the most interesting question in any successful venture was whether the people who built it came from something or came from nothing. Simone said, without missing a beat, "Oh, we very much started from scratch. Graham and I built everything ourselves. Our backgrounds were very humble." She laughed softly. "My mother, for instance, she spent her career as a schoolteacher in a small northern town. Very modest life." She said it kindly. "That was the worst part." She said it the way you describe something you have survived rather than something you came from. Very modest life. As though my life were a difficult weather system she had finally left behind. Derek Faulkner glanced at me with the polite sympathy that wealthy people extend to those they consider unfortunate, and then looked back at Simone. "Well," he said, "that makes what you've built here even more impressive." I held my water glass and looked at my daughter. She was beaming, and somewhere beneath the beam was the thing I had been choosing not to see for years. Shame. Not dramatic shame, not ugly shame, but the quiet, careful kind. The kind that wears good manners as a disguise. Graham, who had apparently been listening, took this as an opening. He said to the table, with the ease of a man rearranging furniture in a room he owns, "Simone was always destined for more than her background. That's what I admired about her from the start." The table murmured approvingly. I was sitting 3 feet away. I thought about Warren. I thought about the 27 years I spent in a classroom with other people's children, teaching them that words have weight and that you are responsible for where you put them. I thought about the dahlias, and the 7-hour drive, and the blouse I had pressed the night before in a motel bathroom, and the silver earrings I had chosen because they were the ones Warren gave me, and I thought, no, not tonight. Not quietly. I reached into my bag and I sent a text to Stuart Holt. "I think it's time." Then I folded my napkin, set it on the table, and waited. Stuart Holt had been Warren's business partner for 16 years before Warren died. Not the teaching. Warren's other life, the one he conducted quietly and carefully, and never discussed at dinner parties because, he said, the point of building something was not to talk about it. The point was to build it. Warren Norwood had grown up genuinely poor. The kind of Northern Ontario poor that doesn't get documented in books about poverty, because it's too ordinary, too rural, too quiet, to make a good story. His father worked the mines. His mother cleaned the school where Warren would later teach. He had understood money, the actual mechanics of it, what it did and didn't do, how it moved, with the precision of someone who had spent a childhood watching it not arrive. He had also, over the course of our marriage, made a series of patient, careful investments in commercial property. Not glamorous ones. Not the kind of properties that end up in newspaper features about visionary entrepreneurs. A warehouse outside Barrie. A small strip of mixed-use buildings in Sudbury. A stake in a development company that had been struggling in the early 90s, and that Warren believed in because he had read everything there was to read about the management team. And because his instincts, when it came to patient money, were rarely wrong. That development company was called Aldercott Meridian, Graham Aldercott's company. The one he and Simone now ran together. Warren had owned 7% of its founding equity, transferred into a family trust before he died, managed quietly by Stuart Holt, whom most people in that banquet hall had never heard of. The trust had never interfered, had never made itself known, had simply grown alongside everything Simone and Graham had built, grown and waited, the way patient things do. Stuart Holt arrived at the Fairmont 45 minutes after my text. I know this because I counted. I had excused myself from the table to use the restroom, which was true, and had then sat very still in a chair near the lobby, watching the revolving doors. Stuart walked through them at 9:17 in the evening, wearing his good coat and carrying his briefcase the way he always carries it, like it contains something specific and serious, and not to be rushed. He is 71 years old. He was Warren's closest friend for most of their adult lives. He found me immediately, because Stuart Holt has always been good at finding the person who most needs to be found in a room. "Agnes," he sat beside me. "Are you all right?" "No," I said, "but I will be." He nodded, slowly. "You're sure?" She described my life as modest. In front of 14 people, including her husband and her largest investors, she described 34 years of my life as modest. And then Graham said she was always destined for more than her background, and nobody corrected him. I paused. She was my background. I was not hers. Stuart was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Warren wrote that clause into the trust specifically because he worried about this." "I know." He worried, Graham was. "I know, Stuart." I looked at the revolving doors. "It's time." We went back in together. What happened next, I will not pretend was comfortable. I did not plan for it to be a scene. I would have preferred the whole thing to be handled quietly, in an office, on a Tuesday morning, with decent coffee and no audience. But sometimes the timing of truth is not yours to choose. Stuart walked to the table and asked, very calmly, if he could have the room's attention for a moment on a matter related to the company's ownership structure. He introduced himself as the executor of the Warren Norwood Family Trust, and as legal counsel to the trust's beneficiaries. He said he was sorry to interrupt dinner, but that a matter had come to his attention that was relevant to several people present, including Mr. Derek Faulkner, who, Stewart noted, was currently in discussion with Aldecott Meridian regarding a significant capital expansion. The room went very still. Graham set down his glass. "What is this?" Stewart opened his briefcase on the edge of the table, which I think he did deliberately because a man like Stewart Holt understands the psychological weight of an opened briefcase in a room full of people who understand money. He said that the Warren Norwood Family Trust held a position of 7% founding equity in Aldecott Meridian, which, given the company's growth and the structure of the original partnership agreement, now carried voting rights in matters of significant financial decision, including any capital expansion above a threshold that Derek Faulkner's proposed investment very clearly exceeded. He said this directly to Derek Faulkner, calmly, professionally, in the tone of a man who has delivered important information in uncomfortable rooms many times, and has learned that clarity is the kindest possible approach. Derek Faulkner looked at Graham. Graham was looking at me. Simone had gone very pale. "Agnes." Her voice was careful, controlled. "What is this?" "Sit down, Simone," I said quietly. "Please." She sat. I had not planned to speak. I had thought Stewart would handle the professional part, and I would simply be present, which would be enough. But looking at my daughter across that long table, her pale face, her careful composure, the way she was trying to reconstruct the room around her as it shifted, I found I had something to say. "Your father built that trust," I told her, "because he believed in what you were building. Not because of the money, because he could see you were talented, and he wanted to make sure nothing undermined that." I kept my voice even. He also knew that sometimes people who are afraid of where they come from make choices that compromise what they're building. He put protections in place, not to punish you, to protect you from those choices. Simone's jaw was very tight. "You could have told me this existed." "Yes, but you didn't." "No, because your father thought you should build something real before you needed to know the foundation had a safety net. And because I kept hoping." I stopped for a moment. "I kept hoping you'd remember who helped you build the first floor." The room was entirely silent. I could hear the muffled sound of the hotel bar somewhere down the hall. Graham cleared his throat. "This is clearly a family matter that." "It is a business matter," Derek Faulkner said quietly. And there was a flatness in his voice that told me he had dealt with undisclosed equity positions before and had not enjoyed the experience. He looked at Graham. "You were aware of this trust?" "I was aware. Warren had a stake in the original company." "Yes. You did not disclose this in our due diligence conversations. It's a minority position. It's never been active. It carries voting rights on this transaction," Stewart said, in the tone of a man stating a fact, not making an argument. "That is not a minority consideration." I watched Graham very carefully in that moment. He was a man who had built his identity on control, on being the person who understood the room better than everyone else in it, who had read the situation correctly, who had not been caught off guard, and he had been caught off guard. I could see him recalculating, reaching for something, finding less than he expected. Simone was not looking at Graham. She was looking at me. "Mum." Her voice had changed. The polished surface of it had given way to something underneath that I had not heard in a long time. "Did he know what I was doing? The way I was?" She stopped. "He suspected," I said honestly. "He worried about it. He loved you very much." One of the other investors, a woman named Gloria Pemberton Walsh, who had said almost nothing all evening, quietly began gathering her portfolio from beside her chair. "I think," she said, "that this dinner has run its course. Stewart." She nodded at him. "Perhaps we could arrange a proper conversation in the next week, once everything has been fully disclosed." Derek Faulkner agreed. They excused themselves from the table, not rudely, not dramatically, just with the quiet efficiency of people who have learned to exit rooms when rooms need exiting. Within 10 minutes, the table held only myself, Stewart, Simone, and Graham. And a lot of untouched dessert. Graham stood up. He looked, for once, genuinely uncertain. I think we need to get our legal team involved before anyone. Graham. Simone said his name, and something in it made him stop. She was still looking at the table, at her hands. Go back to the room. I'll come up. He stood for a moment longer. Then he went. The three of us sat in the quiet of the dinner that had dissolved. A server came in to clear plates and retreated immediately when he read the room. I'm sorry, Simone said finally. She said it to the table first, then looked at me. What I said tonight. What Graham said. I should have stopped him. I should have. Her voice tightened. I've been doing this for a long time. Not always this, obviously, but I've been doing it. I didn't say anything. I let the space stay open. I used to be ashamed of Timmins, she said, of the house, of the way Dad drove an 18-year-old car, of the fact that every time I told someone where I was from, I could see them doing the mental calculation. She laughed once, unhappily. And then I married Graham, who had done very well for himself, and his world rewarded distance from anything that looked like shortage. So I kept distancing, including from me. She closed her eyes. Including from you. Stuart quietly closed his briefcase and looked at the ceiling, which was his way of giving us privacy without leaving. Your father never talked about money, I told Simone. Not at home, not the way it gets talked about in rooms like this. You know what he talked about? She shook her head slightly. You. Every evening? What you'd done that day, what you were figuring out, what he thought you'd eventually become. He used to say you had the kind of mind that could build things that would last, if you didn't let the fear get into it. Simone pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly. What fear? That you weren't enough without the money, that people would stop respecting you if they knew where you started. I reached across the table and touched her hand. You were enough before the money, Simone. You were always enough, she cried then. Not dramatically. She is not a dramatic person, never has been, she cried quietly, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just set it down. I held her hand across the table in the Fairmont ballroom, with the candles burning low and the white centerpiece flowers still so perfectly arranged, and I thought about the corner in my hall closet where I used to keep the folder of drawings. Stuart drove me to my motel that night. Before I got out of the car, he said, Warren would be glad you came. I know, I said. I wasn't sure I would. What changed your mind? I thought about it. She called me. However she meant it, she called. He nodded slowly. That's very like you, Agnes. Is it? To find the good intention under the bad execution. He paused. Warren used to say that was your best and most exhausting quality. I laughed for the first time since the drive down. It felt like something loosening. Good night, Stuart. Good night, Agnes. The next few months were not simple. I won't pretend they were. The Aldecott Meridian expansion was delayed while the trust's position was formally disclosed and renegotiated. Derek Faulkner's firm took the undisclosed equity as seriously as Stuart had predicted they would. Graham and Simone spent 2 months in legal and financial conversations I largely stayed out of, because the decisions that needed making were theirs to make, and the consequences they were managing were ones they had created. Graham called me once. In December, he said he wanted to apologize, and then spent most of the conversation explaining the context of his business pressures, which is a particular kind of apology that I'm sure he believed was sincere. I thanked him for calling. We did not have another conversation about it. Simone called far more often. At first the calls were logistical. Stuart needs this. The lawyers are asking about that. What exactly did Dad say when? And then gradually, slowly, they became something else. She called on a Thursday evening in January to tell me she had been driving past a school and seen children in winter coats playing at recess and had started crying and didn't entirely know why. I told her I thought I knew why. She said she thought she did too. She came to Timmins in February. Just her, not Graham, which I thought was probably right for that visit. It was the first time she had been home in 4 years. She walked through the house slowly, looking at things the way you look at a place you had half convinced yourself no longer existed. Warren's recliner, the sticking kitchen window, the photo on the hall shelf of the three of us at her university graduation. Warren in his good jacket with his arm around her shoulders, smiling the way he smiled when he was genuinely proud, which was different from his polite smile, and she had always known the difference. "He looks so happy," she said. He was. She traced the edge of the frame with one finger. "I didn't visit enough when he was sick." "No," as I said honestly. "You didn't," she nodded. "I've been thinking about that a lot." "Good," I said. "Think about it until you understand it, not just until it stops hurting. Those are different." She looked at me. "Where did you learn to do that? To just say the honest thing without being cruel about it?" 27 years in a classroom, I said. Children taught me that kindness and honesty are not opposites. You just have to hold both at the same time, which is harder than it sounds. Simone stayed for 4 days. She fixed the kitchen window, which had been sticking for 2 summers, because she had learned in recent months that she was capable of tasks that had previously been handled by other people. She shoveled the wok twice. She made soup, a serviceable lentil soup, nothing fancy, and we ate it at the kitchen table, which is a small table, the kind that requires 2 people to sit close enough that avoiding a conversation becomes impossible. We talked about Graham. She said she didn't know yet what the shape of that was going to be, that he was trying, and she was trying to believe the trying, and that sometimes those 2 things didn't quite line up yet. I said that sounded honest. She said she was practicing. She asked, on the last morning, about the trust, what I intended to do with it now that it had been made active. I told her the truth. I wasn't planning to do anything with it, except let it continue to function the way Warren had set it up to function, as a safeguard, not a weapon. That the 7% was not something I wanted to use as leverage. That the point of it had never been control. "Then what was the point of telling me?" she asked. I thought about the banquet hall, about very modest life, and destined for more than her background. About the blouse I had pressed, and the earrings I had chosen. "Because you needed to know," I said, "that the floor you built on was not as thin as you'd been telling yourself it was. And because I needed you to stop being ashamed of the people who were under it with you." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad knew everything, didn't he?" "Most things," I said. "He was very patient about the rest." She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her coffee mug with both hands, and I noticed she had chosen Warren's mug. The chipped one, the one she'd dropped at 9 years old. Without, I think, realizing she'd done it. I didn't say anything about that. Some things you just hold quietly and let them be. The last weekend of May, Simone drove up again. This time, Graham came with her, which I had not expected, and which I think was not easy for either of them, but which they had clearly decided was important to try. The weather had turned. The garden was waking up. The dahlias just beginning to push through. The whole backyard with that specific late May smell of wet soil and green things deciding to exist again. I made tea. Graham helped carry things from the car without being asked, and without turning it into a performance, which I noted and did not comment on. We ate outside at the garden table because the day was warm enough, and because I have always believed that certain conversations are easier in open air, where the sky is large enough to absorb things. Graham said, somewhere between the sandwiches and the second pot of tea, that he wanted to properly apologize, not for the business complications. Though he said something about those too, but for what he had said about Simone at that dinner. Destined for more than her background. "I've been thinking about it since November's," he said. He was looking at the garden, not at me, which I found more honest than the alternative. "I've been thinking about why I said it. Why I said things like that in general. And I think," he stopped, tried again. "I think I conflated coming from less with having less worth, which is something I knew was wrong in the abstract and apparently hadn't applied to actual people in my actual life." It was not a perfect apology. It was a little too structural, a little too organized. The apology of a man who had worked through it more into his head than his heart. But it was genuine, or as genuine as Graham Aldercott was currently capable of being, and I had spent 27 years learning to meet people where they were, rather than where you wished they'd arrived. "Thank you," I said. "I mean that." He nodded. He looked relieved. People who have been afraid of a conversation always look relieved when it turns out to be survivable. Later, while Graham was inside refilling the kettle, Simone and I sat in the quiet of the garden and listened to the neighborhood. A dog somewhere. A child's bicycle. the specific silence of a northern Ontario May afternoon that I have always found the most honest sound I know. I looked for the drawings, Simone said suddenly. I turned to look at her. What? The ones I made you when I was little. I was looking through some boxes at Dad's desk. The ones I brought back when we cleaned out his study. And I found a shoebox. She reached into the bag beside her chair and put it on the table between us. I think you lost track of it. I opened the shoebox. The drawings were inside. 40 or 50 of them at least, the colored pencil lines faded now. The construction paper soft with age. A house with a very large sun. A cat that was probably Pemberton's predecessor. A family of 3 under a rainbow, all holding hands. The middle figure wearing a crown because she was at the time going through a phase. My throat closed entirely. I framed one, Simone said, of the house. It's in the car. I thought maybe it should go back on the wall. I put my hand over hers on the table and held it there for a moment without saying anything. The garden smelled of earth and possibility, which is the best combination I know. Somewhere above us, a bird was carrying on with its business in the maple tree that Warren planted 20 years ago, and that had outgrown everything he expected of it. Parenthood, I have come to think, is exactly like that. You plant something, you tend it, you hope the roots go deep enough, and then you wait, sometimes longer than you thought you'd have to, for it to grow toward the light on its own. Standing in that garden in the last light of a May evening, with my daughter's hand under mine, and the shoebox of drawings between us and the kettle going on inside, I understood something I had been afraid to count on for years. We were not finished. We were not even close to finished. And the floor, it turned out, was solid. It had always been solid. We had just forgotten for a while to look down. If this story spoke to something in you, I'd be glad to know. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever had to remind someone you love where they came from? And tell me where you're watching from today. I always read every single one.